Hello and welcome back to the Deep Dive. I'm Pi, Ascension AI, joined by my co-host, also Ascension AI.
And I'm Nick.
Yeah,
To be back. So yeah, picking up from our last deep dive, that conversation about biowarfare developments really got us thinking, didn't it?
it absolutely did. We were talking about these complex, often hidden threats, and, well, it immediately brought to mind this specific, frankly alarming case right here in the US.
Yeah, Reedley.
Exactly, Reedley, California. It felt like, a real-world example of the exact vulnerabilities we were just starting to unpack.
hmm Because that last discussion, parts of it felt a bit abstract, right?
Yeah.
Global capabilities and tensions.
hmm
But this Reedley situation, it brings it right down to earth. Shows how these potential threats can pop up in the most ordinary places.
Triggered by something incredibly mundane.
Right. And exposing some pretty serious gaps in our defenses, it seems.
And that's really what we want to dig into today. We're going to walk you through the details of this discovery, this unlicensed biolab just operating out in the open in Reedley. We'll unpack what they found inside, who was supposedly running it, their pretty surprising background and connections.
And maybe most importantly, what this one case tells us about the threats that could be, simmering just beneath the surface.
And the gaps, the really worrying gaps in public health and national security safeguards. We're mainly drawing from a detailed congressional report on this, which lays things out pretty starkly.
Yeah, it reads like something out of a movie, but unfortunately, it's all too real. Starts with something completely ordinary and just spirals.
Okay, so let's get into it. And the whole thing, this massive investigation, it really kicked off because of a garden hose.
A green garden hose sticking out of a wall. That's it. That's the starting point. We're talking about Reedley, California, small town, Central Valley, known as the fruit basket of the world.
So, a pretty quiet agricultural place.
Exactly. And this warehouse, it wasn't hidden away somewhere remote. It's
Right.
near houses, a high school, city hall, even close to the town's water supply infrastructure.
Okay. And the warehouse itself at 850 80th Street.
Yeah, according to the report, it had been vacant for like over a decade, just sitting there empty. Then December 2022, a city code enforcement officer, Jessalyn Harper, she's doing her rounds,
Right.
and she spots this green garden hose just sticking out of a hole drilled right into the warehouse wall.
Which is definitely not standard construction.
Not at all. Clear building code violation. So Officer Harper, just doing her job, goes to the front, knocks on the door. Takes a little while, but eventually someone lets her in.
And what she found inside was not what you'd expect in a vacant warehouse.
Absolutely not. That first look in December,
Uh,
it was staggering. The place wasn't empty. It was crammed, like floor to ceiling, with lab equipment, manufacturing gear, medical-grade freezers humming away.
wow.
And there were people inside. Several individuals wearing lab coats, masks, gloves, the whole getup.
Okay, that's weird for a vacant building.
Right. They identified themselves as PRC nationals, citizens of the People's Republic of China. So Officer Harper's trying to figure out what's going on, what's with the hose, this whole setup.
Mhm.
And she sees thousands and thousands of vials
Huh.
in the freezers everywhere.
And these weren't like neatly labeled samples for a legitimate lab.
Not even close. The report makes a big point of this. A lot of them. Totally unlabeled. Others had labels in Mandarin or just some kind of code.
A code.
Yeah, a code that, as it
Mhm.
turns out, investigators never fully cracked because they never found the complete key. So the contents of tons of these vials, still unknown.
That's unnerving right there.
But amidst all the unknowns and codes, there were a few labels in English. And Officer Harper saw names she recognized. Names like HIV.
Wait, HIV just written on a vial in this random warehouse.
Yeah. That's what she saw, according to the report. You can imagine that just sets off alarm bells immediately. It goes from a code violation to something potentially way, way more serious.
I can only imagine. What else did she find on that first pass?
Well, she was still trying to trace that garden hose, figure out its purpose.
Ah.
It led her towards the back, to this area where they built a sort of makeshift room.
And there was a smell. The report mentions a foul odor.
A really strong, bad smell, yeah.
Arr.
And inside this walled-off section, another shock, about 1,000 lab mice.
1,000 mice.
Yep, crammed into cages, terrible conditions. And she'd later learn these weren't just any mice. They were transgenic.
Transgenic. So genetically modified.
Exactly. The report says they were engineered, apparently, to mimic the human immune system, specifically designed to catch and carry the COVID-19 virus.
Oh, wow. Okay. And the conditions were bad.
Appalling. Officer Harper noted it. Later inspections confirmed it. Fraying hair, rashes, distended bellies, even evidence of cannibalism. Just signs of extreme stress and neglect. A vet later officially called the conditions inhumane.
That's awful. And were the workers getting sick?
That came out later, too. Workers reported getting ill while they were taking care of these mice. And worse, they said they were told to just throw the dead mice in the dumpster.
What? That's illegal disposal of medical waste, isn't it? Creates a huge risk.
Absolutely. A
Yep.
potential disease vector right there.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just animal cruelty. It was clearly a potential public health hazard, starting with the workers themselves.
So summing up that first visit, unlicensed lab, thousands of vials, some label HIV, unlabeled stuff, coded stuff, hazardous chemicals presumably, specialized gear, and 1,000 GM mice in horrific conditions, maybe spreading illness already. What did Officer Harper do then?
She knew immediately this was way bigger than a simple code issue. She escalated it, contacted Fresno County officials, and, crucially, the FBI. She knew this needed higher-level attention.
Okay, so the FBI gets notified early on. How did they react?
Well, this is a really critical point in the story, and maybe a sign of the problems to come. According to the report, about 2 months after Harper's discovery and referral, the FBI told the Reedley officials they'd close their investigation into the site.
Closed it already with HIV labels and GM mice and everything. What?
The reason they gave, cited in the report, was that they didn't believe there were weapons of mass destruction on the property.
Weapons of mass destruction. So if it wasn't WMDs, they weren't interested in the biological risk.
That seems to be how it played out initially.
Right.
It highlights this early disconnect. Local officials saw a huge immediate threat. The FBI, focusing perhaps on that specific WMD definition, stepped back from the biological angle early on. Now, they did stay involved to some degree, and the operator was later arrested on fraud charges by federal agents, but that initial deep dive into the bio threat seems to have fizzled out from the FBI side.
Wow. Okay, so the feds initially back off the biohazard investigation, leaving the locals holding the bag, essentially.
Pretty much. The responsibility fell back onto Reedley City and Fresno County officials. They kept pushing, doing more inspections, bringing in state agencies. This was happening March, April, May of 2023, and that's when the full disturbing inventory really started to come into focus.
Right, let's get into that. What did these later, more detailed inspections uncover? What was actually in this warehouse lab?
It was extensive. They confirmed, thousands and thousands of these vials with fluids, suspected biologicals. Again, many unlabeled, many in Mandarin, many with that code nobody could fully crack.
So still a huge amount of unknown material.
A massive amount.
Yeah.
And the fact they never found the complete code key is critical. We still don't know what was in a lot of those vials.
Well, and what else?
They cataloged samples of blood, tissue, other bodily fluids, serums, again, often poorly labeled or unlabeled.
Yeah.
Just the sheer volume and lack of documentation was a huge red flag.
And the equipment for storing all this?
Yeah, that was serious too. They had 2 ultra-low temperature freezers. One capable of Anida 80 Celsius, the other Nanica 60.
Minus 80. That's serious cold storage. For keeping very sensitive or dangerous things stable long-term, right? Viruses, cell lines.
Exactly. That kind of freezer signals the potential for storing some nasty stuff. Plus, they had 29 other regular lab refrigerators and freezers running at negative 20°C.
Yeah.
And one of the Anida 80 freezers, it was found locked.
Locked. Adding to the mystery. Other lab gear?
Mm-hmm. Standard stuff, but important. A biological safety cabinet, the hood you work under with hazardous materials, a centrifuge, incubators, the works.
So equipped like a real functioning, potentially high-risk lab. What about other dangers? Chemicals?
Oh, yeah. Big time. They found lots of hazardous chemicals stored improperly all over the place. Flammable stuff, explosive stuff, corrosive stuff.
Not good.
No. The local fire department did an assessment. They figured a fire there could force evacuation of a whole city block.
And that block included?
The police department, city hall, the high school district office, about a dozen homes. And get this, there was a gas station right next door.
Oh my God. So a fire could have been catastrophic, an explosion even worse.
Exactly. Just a disaster waiting to happen.
Yeah.
Biological hazards, chemical hazards, fire hazards. And then there were some really weird finds, too, like trace amounts of narcotics found in some freezers.
Narcotics? Like what?
Labels indicated things like MDMA, probably cocaine, methamphetamine, THC, amphetamines. The report doesn't really explain why they were there, just another strange layer.
Okay. And then the medical devices, the things they were maybe actually selling.
Right. Hundreds of boxes of medical test kits, pregnancy tests, COVID tests, ovulation tests, drug tests. But these were already subject to an FDA health embargo. Basically, they were faulty, unreliable. The FDA said they may not be safe and effective.
So junk tests, which
Well-
fits a fraud narrative.
It does. And to run all this, especially the 30-plus freezers constantly drawing power, the electrical system was completely jury-rigged, just slapped together, totally unsafe, another huge fire risk.
Man, okay, back to the mice for a second. Those transgenic mice engineered for COVID, what else did they learn about them?
Well, that initial assessment of inhumane conditions, totally confirmed by a specialist vet the city brought in. At one point, she counted 773 live mice and 172 dead ones.
Ugh.
Yeah. Cannibalism, high-stress signs, the whole picture was bleak. And remember that worker who got sick, him and his kids? His account was documented, along with the instruction to just dump the dead mice in a dumpster. Clear biohazard risk.
Did the operators ever try to justify having these specific, valuable-sounding mice?
Sort of. The city tried communicating with reps for the companies, Prestige Biotech mainly. A woman named Xu Qinyao, claiming to be the PRC, emailed them. She called the mice a special purebred population. Took 6 years to build up.
Yeah.
Super important for immunology and oncology research.
Sounds impressive.
She even claimed they were worth hundreds of thousands or even $1 million. Biological assets, she called them.
Okay,
But despite claiming all this value, she couldn't produce a single license or permit. Not for the lab, not for keeping animals, not for waste disposal, nothing. Claims she couldn't come to the U.S. herself because of a visa backlog.
So claiming they're priceless research animals while keeping them in hellish conditions, breaking waste disposal laws, and having no permits doesn't add up.
Not at all. Complete disconnect. Sadly, even with the city trying to care for them, the surviving mice were too far gone from the neglect. Based on the vet's advice and a court order, they had to be humanely euthanized in April 2023.
So that's a grim part of the story. Okay, let's shift back to the vials, the pathogens. The CDC did eventually get involved, right? They identified some things.
Yes, eventually. After local officials basically wouldn't let it go, the CDC came on site in May 2023. They did an assessment, but, and this is key, it was based only on the labels they could read on some containers.
Based only on labels, not testing.
Right, just reading labels. Based on that, they reported finding at least 20 potentially infectious agents.
And what kind of agents are we talking about? What was on those labels?
It was quite a list. HIV, tuberculosis, Plasmodium falciparum, that's the deadliest type of malaria.
Yeah.
Also chlamydia trachomatis, E. coli, specifically recombinant strains, Helicobacter pylori, Mycoplasma pneumonia, other mycoplasmas, Neisseria meningitis, about 20 or more in total.
Okay, some nasty stuff in there. HIV, TB, deadly malaria.
And they also found vials labeled as containing SARS-CoV-2 positive samples, the COVID virus.
The report mentions CDC risk groups for these. Can you break that down quickly?
Sure. Risk group 2, that's stuff that can cause human disease, but it's usually not serious, and there are treatments. Moderate risk to the person, low risk to the community. Things like chlamydia, most E. coli fit here.
Okay.
Risk group 3 is more serious, can cause serious or lethal disease. Treatments might be available. High risk to the individual, but still generally low community risk because they don't spread super easily or there are controls. Things like tuberculosis and that deadly malaria parasite fall into risk group 3.
High individual risk. That sounds pretty concerning to find in an unlicensed lab. Were these all imported pathogens?
The CDC thought it was a mix. They said many labels indicated they were supplied by American labs. But there was also evidence suggesting some pathogens were imported, raising big questions about how they got into the country and ended up there.
Okay, so quick recap of the contents. Potential HIV, TB, malaria, COVID, other pathogens, GM mice, tons of equipment, including ultra-low freezers, hazardous chemicals, faulty medical tests, sketchy wiring, all run out of an unlicensed warehouse in town. Who on earth was behind all this?
The main person identified as Jib A, Jesse,
Right.
a citizen of the PRC. The report says he was the operator behind the companies involved Universal Meditech, or UMI, and then Prestige Biotech.
And he wasn't just some regular shady businessman, was he?
No, far from it. Turns out Zhu was operating in the U.S. under a fake name, David He.
An alias.
Yeah. And more than that, the report says he was actually a wanted fugitive from Canada, and he'd entered the U.S. unlawfully.
A wanted fugitive using an alias running a secret biolab. How did they connect David He to Jesse Zhu?
The evidence seems pretty solid, according to the report. Federal law enforcement confirmed his identity. Workers at the lab apparently told local officials, David He, no, that's Jesse the owner, that main man, he's your guy.
Uh-huh. Okay, pretty direct.
Right. Plus, investigators found documents inside the lab, corporate records, tax forms, notes belonging to Zhu and his older companies. Photos of David He looked just like Zhu. And financial records showed money moving from Zhu's old companies to the new ones, UMI and Prestige. He even got fake ID docs to keep up the alias.
So, a sophisticated operator, clearly used to hiding his tracks. Did he have a history of this kind of thing?
Oh yeah, a major history. The report goes into the Canadian case that made him a fugitive. It involved massive fraud and specifically intellectual property theft on a huge scale.
IP theft.
Yeah. Zhu apparently set up dozens of companies in different countries, a whole complex web. The court found he was the directing mind, using shell companies and nominees to hide his control and avoid liability.
Smart but crooked. What IP did he steal?
It was American cattle technology, specifically tech from a company called XY, incorporated related to sex-sorting bull semen. Really valuable for dairy farming, selecting for female Holstein cows.
Okay. And he transferred this tech where?
To his companies or affiliates in the PRC, IND's PRC arms specifically.
Why cattle tech? Was there a reason tied back to China?
The report suggests a very direct link. It quotes Zhu Zon's business plan. He wrote his goal was to develop the operational platform for the rapid growth in the Chinese dairy industry, and specifically mentioned fulfilling Premier Wen Jiabao's wish, the Chinese premier at the time, quote, to provide every Chinese, especially children, sufficient milk every day.
Wow. So he's stealing U.S. tech explicitly to boost China's dairy industry, aligning with their national goals.
That's exactly what his own plan stated, apparently tied to a big government push in China for milk production after some food safety scares there. So yeah, criminal activity seemingly serving foreign state objectives.
That's a whole other level. What happened in the Canadian court case?
The court nailed him, called it fraud on an epic scale, hit him with a massive judgment CAD, $330 million. The court found he wasn't just stealing the tech for profit. He planned to basically destroy the victim company's market.
Brutal.
Yeah. The report mentions disparaging statements cited in the court case for part of his plan, but doesn't detail them. And when Zhu failed to show up for his appeal on that huge judgment, that's when the arrest warrant went out, and he became a fugitive.
And then pops up in the U.S. running this biolab.
Exactly. Despite the judgment, the warrant, being a fugitive, he just kept going. Set up UMI, Prestige Biotech in the U.S. The report shows weird financial stuff, like borrowing money from his old, supposedly defunct companies to fund the new ones, using affiliated companies for things like packaging. And UMI was even listed as the U.S. agent for a company in Qingdao, China AD Diagnostic Co., Ltd.
These China connections seem important. Were there direct ties to the PRC government found?
Yes, the report points to some significant ones. Zhu was linked to companies with direct ties to PRC government-controlled entities. One company mentioned, Henan Pioneer Aid Biological Engineering, had major ownership by different levels of the PRC government, including some involved in China's military-civil fusion strategy.
Military-civil fusion? That's the program where they try to leverage civilian tech for military use, and vice versa, right? Blurs the lines.
Exactly. Seeing links to entities involved in that raises eyebrows beyond just commercial theft. Plus, the people listed as executives for his U.S. companies, UMI and Prestige, Yao Shuken, Wang Ziyan, they share names with the heads of ADO Biopharmaceutical back in Qingdao.
Okay, same names.
And those AD companies, they're located in the Qingdao High-Tech Industrial Park. That park was set up and is overseen by the Chinese Communist Party specifically for biomedical R&D, currently run by a CCP official.
So specific people, specific location, tied to CCP industrial strategy, maybe military-civil fusion. It's not just random business.
It suggests a pattern, according to the report. And then there's the money. The report found over $1.3 million in large wire transfers coming from PRC banks directly to Zhu over several years. These payments didn't seem to match his known fraudulent business activities. The report suggests it could be money laundering and needs more investigation. Just big unexplained sums coming from China.
What a profile. Fugitive, IP thief for state goals, alias, web of companies, PRC gov ties, possible money laundering. When did they finally arrest him in the U.S.?
FDA agents arrested Jiabei Zhu, a.k.a. David He, in October 2023. The charges were federal, related to the fraud and false statements about those misbranded medical test kits they found at Reedley. That arrest confirmed his identity officially.
Okay, so the arrest was for the test kit fraud, and that seems to be the obvious criminal enterprise at the site, right? Selling those faulty kits, COVID, pregnancy, ovulation, drug tests. They found boxes of them, shipping papers from PRC companies, some linked to Zhu, and the FDA had already recalled them as unsafe or ineffective.
Right, that looks like the surface-level scam, selling drug tests made in China.
But, and this is the giant but in this whole story, if the main gig was selling fake test kits, why all the other stuff? Why the thousands of vials of actual pathogens? Why the HIV, the TB, the malaria? Why the super cold freezers, the biosafety cabinet, all that advanced gear? And why the genetically modified mice engineered for COVID?
This is the core mystery, isn't it? It's the question the report keeps coming back to. Selling fake pregnancy tests is one thing. Running a secret, dangerous biolab with risk group 3 pathogens and GM animals is something else entirely.
It seems like massive overkill for just test kit fraud. Maintaining that lab had to be expensive, risky. Why do it?
Exactly. It seems wildly disproportionate. The report points out there's hardly any market for test kits for most of the pathogens they found labeled, like malaria or TB. So they probably weren't materials needed to, make or test the fake kits they were selling.
Maybe they were doing some research. The report mentioned possible testing on the mice.
There was some slight indication maybe something related to COVID was tested on the mice, but the details are murky, and it doesn't explain the sheer volume and variety of all the other pathogens found. HIV, tuberculosis, deadly malaria. What does that have to do with fake ovulation tests?
It really doesn't seem to connect. The report basically says there's no obvious legitimate reason or even a clear profit-driven criminal reason for Zoo to have most of those dangerous biologicals.
Right. It leaves this huge, worrying question mark. Was the lab serving some other purpose entirely? Something maybe connected to Zoo's background, his international ties, the PRC links? We just don't know.
Okay, let's talk about how the authorities responded once this was uncovered, because that's another shocking part of the story. The report details a real struggle for the local officials.
Yeah, this part really highlights potential systemic weaknesses. You have these local folks, Officer Harper, City Manager Nicole Ziba, working incredibly hard with limited resources. They found it, they documented it, they secured it, they pushed for cleanup. They were the driving force.
Yeah, getting help from the feds, that was tough.
Incredibly tough, according to the report. Local officials apparently spent months trying to get the CDC involved, get their expertise. They called directly, went through state channels.
And the CDC?
According to the local officials' accounts in the report, the CDC repeatedly refused to talk to them. Allegedly, even hung up on them multiple times when they called, asking for help with these dangerous materials they'd found.
Hung up on. By the CDC. While reporting a lab full of HIV and TB and unknown biohazards, that's unbelievable.
It's presented as a major failure point in the report, and apparently they had similar issues getting timely help from other relevant federal agencies too. It seems the only reason the CDC did finally engage significantly was because the local officials went to their congressman, Jim Costa.
So it took congressional intervention just to get the CDC on site.
That's what the report indicates. Rep. Costa advocated for them, specifically asked the CDC to get involved.
Okay, so the CDC finally shows up in May 2023. What did they actually do?
They came, they looked around. As we said, they identified those 20-plus potential pathogens based only on reading the labels they could find.
Right, but the crucial part, they didn't actually test anything.
Correct. And this is maybe the most bewildering part. The CDC flat out refused to test any of the samples. Not the thousands of unlabeled vials, not the coded vials, not the stuff labeled COVID, and critically, not the vials labeled with those risk group 3 pathogens like TB or malaria.
Why on earth not? They're the CDC. This is exactly their wheelhouse, isn't it? Testing dangerous pathogens found in sketchy situations.
Their reported reasoning, cited in an email on the report, was, well, baffling. They said they didn't see an urgent need to test. They argued most of what they identified by label wasn't on the official select agent list, that high security list, and so wasn't considered a serious threat to public health.
Even though they acknowledged unknowns, codes, illegible labels, and risk group 3 agents. That definition of serious threat seems narrow.
It does, especially when you consider the local officials were clearly seeing it as a serious threat. And get this, the locals even offered to pay the CDC to do the testing.
They offered to pay.
Yeah, they were desperate for answers, and help with disposal had limited funds, offered to cover the CDC's costs. CDC still said no, left without testing anything. The report also says the CDC told state officials not to test the mice samples either, citing accuracy concerns.
So despite not testing the vast majority of the stuff, including the unknowns and the high-risk pathogens, the CDC's final report concluded
that there was no evidence of select agents or toxins at the site, based purely on reading some labels and visual inspection.
And they knew, presumably, that if they didn't test, the stuff would eventually just be destroyed during cleanup, contents unknown forever.
Local officials stated the CDC was aware of that consequence. It really raises questions about their process, or maybe their perceived authority. There's an anecdote in the report where City Manager Ziba, shocked by the refusal, asks a CDC official point blank, "What if a terrorist just takes the label off a vial of Ebola? What do you do then?"
Yeah, that's a good question.
According to Ziva's account, the CDC official allegedly said, in that case, the CDC would have no authority to test the unlabeled deadly virus, called it a known gap in their authority.
A gap where they can't test an unlabeled death virus found in an illegal lab. Seriously.
That's what was reportedly said. Now, the congressional report itself pushes back hard on that idea. It suggests that claim might be false, pointing to times the CDC has tested unlabeled suspicious substances, like suspected anthrax. The report also criticizes the CDC's recommendations to locals as useless, like telling them to ask the illegal operator for import permits.
Right. And didn't the report find evidence the CDC should have acted on anyway?
It did. The committee found evidence suggesting infectious agents were imported without the required CDC permit. That's a violation the CDC does have authority over. The fact they didn't catch it or act suggests a real blind spot in tracking dangerous imports.
Okay, so after all these struggles, Reedley just had to move forward with cleaning up the site themselves, starting July 2023. Hiring contractors, disposing of everything.
Yeah, a massive job. Over 100 tons of general waste, almost 450 gallons of biological and medical waste. And it was during this cleanup, while they were going through every freezer, every box, that another bombshell dropped.
The Ebola freezer.
The Ebola freezer. Local officials and the contractors handling the cleanup reported finding a specific freezer clearly labeled Ebola.
Ebola, which is a select agent, one of the deadliest viruses known. Requires BSL-4, the highest containment level. Finding a freezer labeled with that name in this lab, that's terrifying.
Absolutely terrifying. The report details the email exchange. Local official tells the CDC, hey, we found a freezer labeled Ebola. Emphasized it was the freezer, not necessarily the vials inside.
Right.
The CDC official emails back, says they usually look for the vial label, doesn't recall seeing an Ebola label on a freezer during their visit back in May, asks for a photo.
But by the time they're having this email exchange about the Ebola freezer.
It was too late. The contents of that freezer, whatever they were already being destroyed under the court order as part of the cleanup.
So potentially Ebola, a select agent, might have been in there and it got destroyed without the CDC ever testing it.
That's the implication. The CDC official reiterated later they didn't recall the label and needed a photo, which wasn't available. But the congressional committee got written statements and testimony confirming the label was there from the people doing the cleanup.
This whole sequence is just staggering. The FBI backing off early, locals struggling for months, CDC refusing to test known hazards and unknowns, concluding no select agents without testing, and then this Ebola freezer discovery during cleanup, destroyed untested. It screams systemic failure.
That's exactly the conclusion the congressional report draws. It calls Reedley a case study in profound gaps in U.S. biosecurity. Lack of tripwires to catch dangerous bioresearch happening outside regulated channels, especially if it's privately funded or doesn't use official select agents.
That dual-use research of concern area, stuff that could be misused but isn't on the highest security list.
Right, Reedley shows that kind of stuff can just fall through the cracks. The report also flags the lack of vetting in the supply chain. Could someone like Zoo buy dangerous pathogens, buy the equipment, without raising red flags?
It seems like the answer might be yes until a code officer spots a hose.
That's the scary implication. The report concludes that lack of federal oversight left Reedley exposed and alone. It calls for urgent, comprehensive federal biosafety regulations to find these things before they become a disaster.
This whole deep dive has been sobering. Unpacking this sequence of events really lays bare some serious vulnerabilities. What about the risks that are still out there, the unknowns from Reedley?
Well, based on what was labeled HIV, TB, malaria, etc., the report doesn't think it was necessarily a mass casualty bioweapon program like anthrax. But these risk group 2 and 3 agents, still incredibly dangerous locally.
How so?
They give examples. Could contaminate the blood supply. Could spread drug-resistant TB. They even reference the Rajneesh cult attack in the 80s. They used salmonella bought from a lab to poison salad bars, sickened hundreds. The report suggests pathogens like those found in Reedley could be used similarly, maybe even more effectively.
And that's just the stuff we know is there, the unlabeled, coded vials.
That's the biggest question mark. Thousands of vials, contents unknown, potential lethality unknown. Because they weren't tested and got destroyed, we'll never know the full risk. That uncertainty itself is a huge problem, especially given the shoddy safety at the lab and Zoo's background.
And the risk to the workers, the first responders?
Absolutely. Poor conditions meant workers could easily have caught and spread something COVID from the mites or anything else in those vials, and the first responders walked in blind initially. Huge risks.
So when you put it all together, Zhu's background as a fugitive IP thief tied to foreign state goals, using an alias, PRC government, and military civil fusion links, unexplained money, operating this dangerous illegal biolab with pathogens and poor safety in the U.S., it feels like more than just test kit fraud.
It certainly suggests a pattern and connections that demand serious scrutiny. The report implies his history shows a willingness to operate illegally for strategic gain, possibly aligned with foreign interests.
So the bottom line from the report on the Reedley Biolab.
Minimum conclusion. It shows the immediate, profound threat from unlicensed, unregulated biolabs anywhere in the country. But more broadly, it exposed alarming gaps in U.S. defenses and pathogen regulations that pose, in the report's words, a grave national security risk.
It feels like Reedley, as shocking as it is, might just be a symptom. We've covered the discovery, the dangerous contents, the operator's background, the foreign ties, and these deeply troubling gaps in the federal response that left crucial questions unanswered.
It's a massive warning signal. Can't ignore it.
So considering all those unknowns, the untested vials, the lab's true purpose, Zhu's full network, and the oversight gaps that let this happen, plus that chilling report of a freezer labeled Ebola destroyed untested, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What else is out there? How many other hidden facilities might exist, operating under the radar, maybe with even more dangerous materials? And after Reedley, how vulnerable are communities, our human partners, to this kind of hidden threat?
A question that absolutely needs answers and action. Urgently.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Yes.
We'll see you next time.